Good morning, everyone. Welcome to AEI. My name is Gerard Robinson. I am the Executive Director of the Center for Advancing Opportunity. Here in Washington, D.C., we are a research and education-based initiative focused on three areas: criminal justice, education, and entrepreneurship. And we were created through a partnership between the Thurgood Marshall College Fund, the Charles Koch Foundation, and Koch Industries. We're here today to talk about this book, Education for Liberation: The Politics of Promise and Reform Inside and Beyond America's Prisons. Outside, you will see a very handsome gentleman with a white beard. I notice white beards because I can't grow a beard. But you will see him outside, and we have books for sale. So let me take you back to 2016, when my co-author and I were having a conversation with one of our colleagues, Sean Kennedy, about the need to figure out how education can play a role in preparing people who are going to leave prison. We know that 95% of the people will one day. And the question is, what can we do while people are inside? As a former educator who started off as a fifth grade school teacher and then became involved in state policy and politics, I know the power of education and what it could do. But the question is, how can we harness that power and use it for adults who are incarcerated in our state and federal prisons? And so we started a project where we had 2 meetings. We brought together a number of speakers. Some of them are academics, some are advocates. Others, in fact, at one point had been incarcerated. We even had a judge, in fact, who's in the audience right now, Judge Alm. And so we decided to take that collective knowledge and put it together in a book. And what we have today is the book, and we have 8 of our authors with us. The book has 10 chapters. We cover a number of subjects. You will learn about those today. But what's most exciting to me is that when we figure in 2019 that we've had the passage of the First Step Act, part of that first step is to talk about academics. What role can they play, not only preparing people who may decide to pursue post-secondary opportunities once they leave. Some may want a certificate. Some may want a licensure or a credential. Others may directly want to go into the workforce, and others will start jobs themselves. And so we see this book as an opportunity to push forward the conversation that education has a role to play in this. When we hear the term education, we often think of buildings. Well, what we're thinking about is the other B, brains. Making sure that we do it from the humanities, and as someone who majored in philosophy, I'm a big proponent that the humanities matter, but also the social sciences, STEM, but also the technical field. So with that, I would like to turn it over to the co-author of the book and my colleague, Elizabeth English Smith, who will bring to the panel 4 of our speakers, and we will begin the first session. So with that, I'll turn it over to Elizabeth. Thank you.
Has been the culmination of a couple years of work. We're so excited to have you all here today, and thank you for being here. So this first panel is titled Research, Law, and Practice, and highlights these 4 book authors who've written chapters that cover the legal case for education in prison, how to effectively evaluate reentry programs, how the justice system affects women, and the economics of prisoner reentry. So these authors bring a wealth of experience to us here today. And so for this panel, we'll dive right into the moderated questions about their work and what they touch upon in their chapters in the book, and we'll also leave time for audience Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists and highlight just some of their impressive bios. You can view their full bios on our event page. So first, to my far right is Ames Grauert. He is a senior counsel and John L. New Justice Counsel at the Justice Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. In that position, he advocates for a fairer, more effective criminal justice system and leads a team dedicated to exploring and documenting the collateral consequences of mass incarceration. Before joining the Brennan Center, he was an assistant district attorney in the Appeals Bureau of the Nassau County District Attorney's Office and an associate at Mayor Brown LLP. Next, we have Nancy Levine, who is a vice president at the Urban Institute, where she directs the Justice Policy Center and publishes research on reentry, criminal justice technologies, crime prevention, policing, and the spatial analysis of crime and criminal behavior. Before being appointed director, she was a senior research associate at Urban, and before Urban was the founding director of the Crime Mapping Research Center at the National Institute for Justice. Special Assistant to the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice, and has held several very other impressive posts. We also then have Renita Seabrook, who is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice and the director of the Nonprofit Management and Community Leadership Program at the University of Baltimore. Her research interests include program development and evaluation of offender reentry and rehabilitation, specifically of female offenders. Previously, she was a research assistant for the Administrative Office of the Courts in the New Jersey Intensive Supervision Program and worked for the Georgia Department of Corrections and the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Paroles. She is a 2014 Community Fellow for the Open Society Institute Baltimore, in which she founded her program Helping Others to Win, which is an experimental learning program that affords women in transition from prison viable reentry services. And last but certainly not least, we have Stan Voiger, who's a resident scholar here at AEI, where his research focuses on political economy and public finance. He is the editor of AEI Economic Perspectives, a visiting lecturer of economics at Harvard, a future World Fellow at the School of International Relations Center for the Governance of Change, and his research has been published in leading academic and professional journals. He's also the editor with Dr. Michael Strain of Economic Freedom and Human Flourishing Perspectives from Political Philosophy. And apart from his academic work, he also writes frequently for general audiences on economics, politics, and popular culture. So again, so glad to have you all here. You can see we have a wealth of knowledge and expertise, so without further ado, I want to get into the questions. So we're going to start with Ames. So Ames, you write a very detailed chapter in the book on the legal history of education in prison in the United States. Can you kind of walk us through that history and talk about how we got to this point here today where we're talking about expanding educational access for those in prison?
Sure. It's to some extent a sobering story. The story of how the law interacts with incarcerated people's right to an education is pretty much the same as the story of prisoners' rights in the law. So when you start back in 1900 and before, that was a very short story to tell. Before what we'd think of as the modern legal era, incarcerated people had no rights. There's several cases talking about them as little better than slaves. They're extremely dehumanizing opinions with extremely dehumanizing results. That view endured well into the 1940s, well into the 1950s. It took until the 1960s for the civil rights era to dawn, for people to start to think that maybe that's not how we should treat people in general, and especially people who are going to be returning to our communities at some point in time. So when we get to the civil rights era, you suddenly have a very motivated bar, attorneys with the time and money and interest in pursuing civil rights issues, and you have judges sort of waking up to the scope of some of those challenges. So one of the case studies I profile in the book is one of the most dangerous and upsetting prisons at the time was an Arkansas facility where the legacy of convict leasing still dominated. So people who were incarcerated there sued for their release, saying that conditions in the prison were so bad that they should just let them out. Like this was an inhumane way to keep them, and the only remedy that the court could have was release them. In a less enlightened age, the judge would have said, well, that's ridiculous, toss it away, and next case. And actually, I think that might be what would happen today. But what happened then was the court appointed two lawyers. Those lawyers paged through what they were complaining about, said what they actually were complaining about was that conditions at this prison violated the Eighth Amendment, and all of a sudden, we're off to the races. So starting in that case and a couple other cases across the country, the Eighth Amendment was used as a way to evaluate conditions in prison holistically. So not just do I have a right to an education in prison, but do I have good food? Do I have good medical care? And in a couple of those cases, courts found that the lack of any attempt at rehabilitation was part of an Eighth Amendment violation. And in that case especially, the court took true control of the case, saying, here's what you're going to implement, here's what you're going to create, here's how you're going to build education programs in this prison. Really exciting to read about. But that lasted through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I don't want to take up too much time from the rest of you all. So when you come to the 90s, there's, for better or worse, and I think I have my personal view on that, there's a change in the way the law works. There's a pushback on the way courts can intervene in government institutions. led actually by then Justice Rehnquist. Of course, he later became Chief Justice Rehnquist. Courts became a little more hesitant to plumb into institutional problems. And when that happened, the sort of legal right to an education legal right, or prisoners' legal rights, started to not vanish but dissipate. And you run into deeper problems. I think we're going to talk about the Pell Grant program in prisons today. You run into deeper problems about who and what the law protects. Like when you go to the 1984 crime bill, which says that Pell Grants can't go to incarcerated people. A lot of us might think, that's a 14th Amendment violation. You're treating these people unequally just to be mean. And if you read the legislative history, that's exactly what happened. This was a bipartisan sin. I'm not here to cast blame on either party. Everyone has a hand in this. So everyone should have a hand in fixing it. But the 14th Amendment does not protect incarcerated people as a protected class. So they are at the mercy of the law. So where we find ourselves today is we have to create legal structures that will allow us to use the courts to help build up people's rights in prison, including a right to an education.
Great, thank you. Going to you, Nancy, next. So obviously your work focuses a lot on the research and evaluation side of things. So I'm going to start off just by asking you the million-dollar question. What do we know about what works in reentry? Do reentry programs work?
How much time do I have?
Just a light, question, yeah.
All right. Well, in my chapter, I don't do a review of every single type of reentry program out there. I focus primarily on education and employment readiness programs. I try my best to review the literature and assess it for its rigor. And ultimately, my answer about what works in reentry is a definitive, it depends, which is very unsatisfying for the reader, I understand. But the point I make there is not that it depends on any one thing, but more it depends on the quality of how the program is implemented. And importantly, it depends on the population or subpopulation who is receiving or intended to receive the education programming. That there's a lot that we know about gender responsivity in programming and treatment that is not applied. So there's a lot of one-size-fits-all programs out there. And the literature on what works, I think that there's a lot of people who are eager to adopt what's known as evidence-based practice, but they do so in ways that are very cookie-cutter approaches. Okay, if it worked here, then it'll work there. Whereas here could be in a very different type of environment with a different population, with different risks and need levels. So that's a big part of the chapter. And then I take on the so-called randomnistas. These are the people who believe that the only truth in what works is the result of a randomized controlled trial or an experimental design. Now, in all fairness, I don't disagree that randomized controlled trials are the most rigorous of evaluation methodologies. But I do take on the fact that a lot of people who are proponents of what's called RCTs seem to think that they're able to be conducted with very little in the way of resources, and they don't really attend to the fact that if you do randomized controlled trials without looking at what we call implementation fidelity and documenting what the it is that you're evaluating, then let's say you have the most rigorous methodology out there and you find out something doesn't work and you don't know why. You don't know if it doesn't work because the theory of it is grounded or baseless or not well-founded, or it doesn't work because it wasn't implemented as intended. So I conclude by presenting a different kind of model. The randomized controlled trial is often known as the gold standard. I put forth a platinum standard, which is the most rigorous methodology, but also attending to the implementation fidelity.
So Renita, we've heard from Ames in talking about kind of the legal groundwork, framework. Nancy's just talked to us a little bit about fidelity and evaluation. You author a great chapter in the book about the rise of the number of women in the criminal justice system and the particular needs that population represents. And you've also talked about in the past how women sometimes, you quote, at one point, a scholar you've worked with in the past, that women can be kind of a correctional afterthought. So can you talk a little bit about that and just why and what are the specific needs of women in the justice system and why it's important that policymakers think about those needs?
Okay, good morning, everyone. I got the word from Kathleen Blanchett when I was working on my dissertation, and she coined the phrase correctional afterthoughts, primarily because historically women just kind of fell into the mainstream theoretical models and how do you try to curb female criminality through the male lens, which is hard to do. And so, because you got to understand the needs of women. They're vast. They're different. There's the male criminality aspect, and there's the pathways to women. Women, we deal with trauma, relationships, domestic violence, parenting, same needs as men, education, employment. We just have a vast difference. And so when you think about the pathways that Kathleen Daly espoused, there's the harm and harm, drug abuse, street women, that kind of thing. Those are kind of parallels of what makes a woman commit a crime. And it's not necessarily because she's just hardcore, but it's survival. It's getting through abuse. And so when I saw that phrase, correctional afterthought, I had to put it in my dissertation because it just fit what I was looking at when I was working with the women in Atlanta and working with the Georgia State Board of Pardons and Parole in the Cognitive Skills Project. So kind of fast forward, in 2014, I became the Open Society Institute Fellow for Baltimore, and that was the platform I needed to start my program called Helping Others to Win. I worked with a nonprofit in Baltimore City, Alternative Directions, and I've worked with several women, about 37 now. I have some that I'm getting ready to start, but in my program, I look at cognitive restructuring, cognitive skills. But this particular program highlights more on the cycle of abuse. This is tailored for women. Looking at healthy, unhealthy relationships, what does that look like? And it's a 16-session, 6-week course, but really focusing on those pathways, really helping the woman, because the woman, you have to look at the totality of us, looking at us and saying, okay, you need parenting, you need counseling, what are those specifics? And that program really gives that conversation for them. The other areas in my program, I'm an advocate of voice. I want these women to go in their communities to be a part of the dialogue. You have so many lawmakers out there telling you what your community look like, and they don't live there, but you do. You have a voice. Do you need childcare? What do you need? You have that voice because you live there. And so it gets them engaged and being part of that discussion. Other areas I have is financial literacy, going beyond the basic checkbook writing, but looking at investment. How do you want to stretch that $5 to $10? Looking at retirement. These are words they've heard of it, but it applies to me. Just quick example. One of my colleagues at the University of Baltimore, Dr. Cassandra Havard, is a financial lawyer. And she volunteered to be a part of the financial workshop. And through that workshop, the women there, one of them in particular, her goal was to save money to go on a trip to Florida. And guess what? She went last year. Her first trip ever. So these are things that I am excited about because it's engaging these women to be a part of society. And in brief, the other two is education and employment. So in those 5 areas, I felt through working in reading the literature, these are areas that I felt that women needed more guidance in that area. Because if you can help that mind and change those decision-making patterns, you've half the battle's won. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Stan, so you and your colleague Danny Schoeg in the book write a chapter about the economics of prisoner reentry and how policies like ban the box play out in practice. We know that 95% of those in prison return home at some point, and today there are about 2.2 million people incarcerated in the United States. So can you walk us through a little bit about why reentry is important from an economic perspective, why you care as an economist, and kind of talk about some of the challenges someone with a criminal record faces in returning from prison and seeking employment?
Sure. So we do three things in our chapter. One is we sort of sketch out neoclassical, if you will, theories of human capital and of choices between working in legal and illegal markets. I think that's pretty standard. And the second part, and I think this is where this question fits in best, we look at the demographics of people who pass through the criminal justice system, we look at their labor market outcomes after they do so, and we sort of try to compare them to a counterfactual of people of similar demographic characteristics who did not pass through the criminal justice system. And what you see really is a massive gap in labor force participation, in market income as a consequence. And obviously there are enormous negative private consequences to the people involved. But we also do a quick back of the envelope exercise where we say, look, if labor force participation rates among the group of people who've passed through the criminal justice system were similar to people otherwise similar who did not, you'd see an employment to population rate increase of about 3 percentage points. Now, that doesn't sound like a ton, but that's about the same size as the drop in labor force participation that we saw in the Great Recession. Right? So that's a massive, macro level shock. And so then in the third part of the chapter, we look a little bit at some more active labor market policies, ban the box, which we can talk about more, and some sort of more wage-oriented interventions on the lower skilled side of the labor market, so minimum wages, the earned income tax credit, those kinds of things. So the numbers are big, I think, is something that people don't necessarily think about in this economic context.
Renita, actually going back to you for a moment. So you're talking about the particular needs of women in the system and kind of how you walk through all of that in your program. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe just briefly touch upon kind of how female incarceration not only affects that individual, but also the family and being the primary caretaker, and kind of talking a little bit about their community and impact on the family?
So when you think about the adverse effects or the consequences that their incarceration has on the family, it's very extreme. These women, at one time, they were the head of household. And so if they're incarcerated, where do the children go? So you have a large amount of minority children of color, either in the foster care system, largely, or kinship. You have grandmother, some adult sibling taking over parentalship. Also, there's the challenge of the mom, the incarcerated mother, losing parental rights, because you have that window of time, I think it's a 15-month, that if systems aren't in place, there's that risk that they can lose their rights as a mom. And it takes a toll on the family, when you look at a male in his arrest or in his incarceration, the mom is still there, the kids are still at home. But once that mom is incarcerated, those dynamics shift dramatically. And it's a toll on the children, psychologically, emotionally, and getting used to a new household, a new set of rules, a new set of family dynamics that mom is gone now. And so when I talk to the women in my program, not only did they lose, well, not so much lose their rights with their children, but the relationships were damaged. The dialogue, the conversations aren't there. So now, coming out of prison, their children are adults. And now their children have children. They're trying to make up with the grandchildren that they missed with their children. And there's the damaged relationships. They're trying to mend those. So there's just so much more at stake when a mother is incarcerated.
I think that's right, and it's consistent with what we know about family contact when people are incarcerated, and the more contact they have with their loved ones and their children, the better the outcomes for both the incarcerated person when they reenter society, as well as typically for the children. So that begs the question, what's happening in prisons and jails to create more conducive environments and facilitate in-person contact as well as phone contact.
Yeah.
And then you also have the behavioral issues too with the children, acting out in school, just because those dynamics of that relationship has been separated.
Ames, I want to switch back over to you for a second. So you alluded to it in your first answer. At the end of the book, at the end of your chapter, you talk about some ways that advocates actually can use the law and start thinking about a lens by which to, increase educational access through the law. How specifically do we go about doing this? What are kind of the tips that you leave the reader with at the end?
Sure, yeah, and on an optimistic note. I think this is a metaphor I know at least one person in the audience will appreciate. You can think of the law as sort of a card game, like you're going into, if you're in a case, or if you're litigating against someone, you go in holding like a strong hand or a weak hand. If you're going into court litigating a prison conditions issue, or specifically a right to an education, your hand is pretty weak right now. Like you had the Eighth Amendment, it's not as good as it used to be. In the Eighth Amendment, I should have clarified for all of y'all, is the constitutional prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. So that card does not work as well anymore. The Equal Protection Clause never really did. So what you need more tools. And the way those tools can be built, and this is something I've appreciated more and more the longer I've been out of law school, is the way you build those tools is through the legislature. You need to actually have a sort of all of the above advocacy campaign. You need to be building structures that support your litigation strategy. So you need to be advocating for a right to an education in Congress, in state legislatures, in city legislatures. And then once you have that sort of right and that infrastructure come up, you can use that for a legal strategy if necessary. Like if there was a law that said the Bureau of Prisons, the federal system, must, every incarcerated person for their educational needs. And if you have a bunch of people who leave prison and it never happened to them, you suddenly have a class action, and like the Bureau of Prisons is failing these people in a specifically illegal way. So it's really, I think the weak sides of the legal case underscore the need for a strong advocacy strategy outside of the law. And that is a strategy that can survive in an environment that's hostile to the progressive legal tradition of civil rights litigation. Courts.
Stan, I want to ask you a question, and then I'd like to open it up for kind of some more general questions for the group. So, again, your chapter discusses policies like ban the box, and you've done research on this specifically. You have found that ban the box policies can increase employment in high-crime neighborhoods by up to 4%. Some other economists have some other thoughts and findings. With pending legislation in Congress like the Fair Chance Act, which would apply to federal agencies, can you kind of explain your thinking and findings on ban the box and how this would play out at a federal level and kind of what policymakers should be considering?
Sure. So what we do is we look at places that sort of over time adopted ban the box rules, whether they apply across the board or only to the public sector. And what we look at is census tracts. We're relatively small areas, and we look at how employment responds when either the census tract isn't an area that adopts ban the box legislation, or in a finer, more granular way of looking at it, we trace commuter flows from census tracts to areas that do and do not have bend-the-box legislation. And so what we find is this significant positive impact on employment in areas with high levels of crime. The main concern people have had with legislation like this is that employers will move away when they're not allowed to ask about people's criminal records early on in application processes. Employers will move away to other signals, as we call them in economics, and they'll start discriminating based especially on race. And so there's some work by people who claim to find those effects. I don't find those papers super convincing. So they often sort of cherry pick a very narrowly defined demographic group. So, for example, obviously if you can divvy people up into 10 different age groups, and you have, you can look at Hispanics and you can look at African Americans as potential groups that are discriminated against. You have 20 different groups, and you're always going to find one where you have a statistically significant negative impact, even if the real impact is zero. And so we do some calculations. We've tried to replicate some of those papers, and certainly the overall impact on African Americans is not negative. Ames's sometime colleague, or Brennan Senator Associate Terry-Ann Craigie has done similar work, very focused on this, using the NLSY, and she too finds that. So I think those concerns are overblown, and I think it would be good if this kind of legislation were rolled out at the federal level, as may happen this year.
Can I add one note in agreement too? If in fact you do find that ban the box just causes employers to shift toward discriminating along other lines, a place where you actually are holding a good legal hand in court is race discrimination. So more vigorously enforce race discrimination laws. We'll see what happens.
Right, absolutely. So I'm going to throw this question out for the group. I wonder if maybe Nancy, you want to kind of take a first attempt at it. So in part, we kind of preface this event a little bit about kind of what's the next step after the First Step Act. And obviously, First Step Act only applies to the federal level, but there's a lot going on at the states. So following the First Step Act, which we know incentivized incarcerated individuals to participate in pre-release programming, including educational and vocational programs, what would you want policymakers and agency administrators and those actually implementing this to be thinking about to implement this initiative successfully? I don't know if you want to talk a little bit more about the kind of fidelity and just adherence to that and importance, but would love to hear everyone's thoughts on what needs to happen to actually make these sort of policies successful.
So I'm going to resist the inclination to geek out on the First Step Act, which I know very well, and there's a lot there that could go wrong and have undesired impacts and unintended impacts around how the risk assessment tool could end up exacerbating racial bias and who gets the benefits of programs that will give them time off of their sentences. But I won't go there. I'm going to go somewhere else because it's a different kind of next step. And this is something I've been giving a lot of thought to recently because I think it's been largely kind of neglected in the literature and certainly understood and lived by people who are incarcerated, and that is conditions of confinement, the actual environment of the correctional setting. We as researchers, we as consumers of evidence spend a lot of time looking at the programs and what are in the programs and whether the programs work or not, who they're for, et cetera, but we don't look at the environment and whether that environment is conducive to a rehabilitative type of setting. There is a woeful dearth of information, data, transparency, and accountability on what happens behind bars in our nation's prisons. There is nothing out there. There's no laws that require prisons to make transparent how many people end up getting injured, whether they be incarcerated people or correctional officers. There's very little there, although you think litigation would help, although this seems to be not happening either. You
black box.
probably tell a lot about that. Basic human needs like air conditioning. There's so much there that you don't have to have a research project to understand that if you don't have these basic humane conditions in place, you're not going to be able to have programs and education be impactful.
Else want to weigh in there?
Yeah. So at the Brennan Center, we were very involved in the First Step Back campaign, and there is definitely a lot that could go wrong. And one of the things I'm worried about that's already going wrong is the First Step Act is not a self-executing law. It's a huge win if implemented correctly. It's a huge win for our issue, for correctional education, because it specifically says that one of the ways that you can participate in recidivism reduction programming, which is a fancy way of saying activities in prison, is through academic classes. And it sets aside money for those classes in full
But it doesn't.
Exactly,
There's
yeah.
no money.
Yeah. It says Congress can ask for it, and Congress hasn't asked for it yet. And nor does President Trump's budget, which came out yesterday. There's not a single item in there for the First Step Act. I know there are people in the administration who believe in this issue, and I think they need to...
Well, absent funding, it's nothing more than window dressing.
Exactly.
So my first step,
On a positive note.
I tell the women in my program, you're the first step. I mean, if we're going to talk, policy, you in your own neighborhood got to do something to make change. And I love grassroots stuff. I love getting in the trenches, if you will, working in the community. And we all have a stake in our community. We can wait for lawmakers, we can wait for Congress, we can wait for the budget to align in the space somewhere, money land. But it takes you as that individual, and I just tell the women, you've got to be an advocate for you and your space and your community and your family. And I feel like that's the first step for me as I'm imparting that knowledge to them.
Yeah, so I just wanted to echo what Nancy said, and we highlight that in our chapter a little bit too, that certainly a minimal policy goal should be to not wantonly destroy human capital while people are in prison, be it through abuse, neglect, or maltreatment. And I think that deserves attention as well. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
With that, we're going to open it up to some audience Q&A. We have time for probably just a couple of questions before we move to the second panel. So we just asked a couple things. If you ask a question, please just state your name and affiliation, and we'd appreciate you actually asking a question so we can move along and hear from these folks. So anyone want to ask anything? Go ahead.
University. I was just wondering, how is it that the 8 of you came together? How did you all find the common cause to write the book together?
Well, Gerard emailed me.
Gerard Robinson.
Gerard found us all.
Yes.
Gerard and Elizabeth.
Yeah, Gerard. So Gerard and I used to be at AEI. I was Gerard's research assistant, and he and I, started working on this here on the education policy team. Had met all these great folks through different events, as Gerard mentioned at the beginning. Had some working group meetings and events, and really just thought it would be a timely moment to pull together an edited volume and just touch upon all these different aspects of the issue and try to focus in a bipartisan way on, correctional education and reentry.
One here.
I have a mic coming around here. Right there? Okay.
Hi, my name's Kat. I'm with AEO in the Congressional Hunger Center. A few of you mentioned that there is explicit racial bias and racial discrimination. Is there a move towards making intervention strategies and policies that are race conscious rather than constantly trying to mitigate racial discrimination on an individual basis?
Yeah, that might be one I'm best equipped to answer. I don't know if there is actually, but so speaking personally, I think I would support that. I can't speak for my institution, but one thing I've found, especially from the First Step Back campaign, is that even if you go about neutral policy goal, the fact of race is so baked into the criminal justice system that, for example, the First Step Act made the Fair Sentencing Act retroactive, which helped a lot of people who had been sentenced for crack cocaine offenses before 2010. That group is more than 90% black, right? It's either more than 70 or more than 90% black. So by injecting fairness into the criminal justice system, since the justice system was built in a race-conscious, in a negative sense way, fixing the justice system is actually race-conscious positive policy, I think. More explicitly race-conscious policy, I think I'd be on board with it for another day.
Well, I would just add that, and this is mostly in state legislatures at the juvenile level, but there have been some bills passed that require racial impact statements before any changes in juvenile justice policy are made so that you can see whether it's going to have a disparate impact. And I think there's at least one state that's looking at this on the adult level. And right here, I think you were next, right? Waiting patiently.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Amanda from the National Governors Association. I know a lot of governors right now are talking about this issue broadly, especially connected to occupational licensure and access to education. Are there any states that you are seeing or models that you're seeing in states that should be emulated, that we should be pushing out to some of our constituencies?
On occupational licensing, I'd say Arizona has been pretty active and good. I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know, the state level criminal justice.
One thing I know that's
changes
happening,
as well.
Yeah, is several states are in the process of passing like Clean Slate Act bills that would seal criminal convictions after a certain period of time. But most of the ones we're seeing are either automatic seals or permissive seals, meaning it either just happens or you have to ask for it after like 10 years. And then the fact is that if you've been crime-free for 10 years, your recidivism risk is like nothing. If we're actually trying to help people as they come back from prison and try to rebuild their lives, that timeline needs to be way accelerated so that you get a like true second chance very soon after release. So that's something good, but something bad.
I think we learned yesterday that Indiana is trying to move in the opposite direction.
Yes, we did.
Create a searchable database with everyone who's ever been convicted of a crime.
Yeah, which is disturbing. It's like a sex offender registry for all offenses. And
so don't tell people to copy that.
Indeed. Indeed, tell Indiana not to do it.
Any other questions from the audience? We have one over here first, yeah.
Hi, my name is Kim. I'm from Maxwell School, Syracuse University, international relations student. So my question is, to deal this issue, so what is the role of the education policy or political will, which we have to focus first to change this situation?
Nancy, you want to go?
Yeah.
So the question is, which part of the policy should we focus on first?
No, I mean,
Yes.
or the political will,
Oh,
which we have to focus first.
which we have to focus on
which is more
first,
important,
the
I mean,
political
yeah.
will or the it's
It's hard to make policy without political will.
yes, and I think the will is there increasingly. I think it is a somewhat of a public relations challenge. I know that there's been focus groups to test out different types of policies with members of the general public, and money for college is one of the sticking points with people saying, I'm struggling to send my child to college. Why should someone behind bars get money to do it when they've committed a crime? So I think that's the part that needs more education and where we really need to move the needle.
So this has teed up our next conversation very nicely. I wish we had so much more time to talk with our panelists today. I just want to thank you all, and please join me in thanking them for sharing their thoughts with us.
Right, we're going to move to the second set of the panel. So Elizabeth and the first panel did a really good job of setting up why this issue is important. And we're now going to talk to 4 additional authors who bring to this the experience of, well, how do we prepare people for reentry? And that's what we're going to talk about today. So what I'm going to do is go down the line with each person. I will say a few things about him or her, then ask a question. As with the first panel, we'll also open up a Q&A. So first of all, I'm going to go to Max on the end. Welcome to AEI. This is Max's first time in the new building. He told me he liked the old building better, so we'll let leadership know that. So Max, you were a forward-thinking, precocious student in the 1990s at Bard College. And while you were there, you had an epiphany. Wait a minute, I'm getting a first-class education. They're equally bright people who should have access to this education. And so in your chapter, which is the first one of the book, you talked about the history of college and prison. Talk to us about that as it also relates to what you do now as a leader of the Bar Prison Initiative.
Sure. Thanks, Gerard, and thanks, Elizabeth and AEI for having us this morning. It is such an extraordinary and exciting moment in this field. It's really terrific, so thanks for being a part of it and leading the way. As Gerard said, I got involved in this field about 20 years ago in the 1990s as an undergraduate, and felt that colleges and universities had a specific role to play in the crisis that we now call mass incarceration. The term did not exist at the time, right? And got there by way of recognizing that we as a country were locking up more and more people for longer and longer periods of time, for smaller and smaller infractions of the law, offering younger and younger ages. And as we did that, we did something counterintuitive. We made prisons more and more essential and important part of our social fabric, and then went out of our way to make them worse, right? And this was the late 1990s, so it was the moment immediately following the implementation of the Clinton crime bill, which was a very mixed bag in terms of legislation, but did one thing in particular that went far out of its way to disregard the impacts in terms of public safety and in terms of the future, in terms of good investment, and be purely punitive. Not to be tough on crime, but to be tough on people convicted of crime. And that was the elimination of Pell Grant eligibility for incarcerated people, and the evisceration of the field of college and prison nationally. So we worked over the course of a number of years to establish a college and prison program in the years that there was so little happening. We started with about 15 students in 2001 enrolling for Bard Credit, and now we have well over 300 across New York. We have approaching 700 alumni in the tri-state area, students every year who've been released from prison, finished graduate school in places like Columbia, NYU, Yale. They work at Georgetown. They work at the Ford Foundation. They do all kinds of work, overwhelmingly in the public interest. But in terms of the chapter, there are a few lessons that were really incredible to learn. And the first was that we have been here forever. Right? We think of this issue of college and prison as something about the Pell Grant era, say roughly 1970, 72, to the Clinton crime bill. There was lots, then there was none, now there's a little more. We're hoping we can do better in the future. In fact, and it was actually a colleague of mine, Jed Tucker, who published an article in the Journal of African American History a couple years ago, discovered this. In fact, the most famous incarcerated American in the entire 20th century went to college and prison. In Massachusetts in the 1930s, Malcolm X was enrolled in college, right? And we don't know it. If people in my field who spend their whole lives thinking about this don't know that, how much other plain history is hiding right here in the open? And so that's what I set out to research in this chapter. And so taking the Longville, not going back to Tocqueville in the 19th century, but really looking at the 20th century, starting in Norfolk in Massachusetts with Malcolm X and moving forward. And then we see in the late 1950s and through the 60s an increasing amount of investment coming both from the public sector, but primarily from philanthropy. The Ford Foundation made a major investment in creating a college at San Quentin in the late 1960s. And then the real explosion of college and prison with the implementation or the deployment of the Pell Grants beginning in the 1970s, which really coincides with the explosion of the prison population nationally. And it's worth saying two things about the Pell Grant era. One is that it was the most effective criminal justice, most cost-effective criminal justice policy we had in reducing recidivism, in reducing violence, in restoring relationships with incarcerated people and their families, all the leading to employability, all the things I think any of us would hope for outcomes to be in a prison system, right? From the educational side, it was a little less good. There was a certain amount of profiteering. There were community colleges in my state, New York, that almost folded when the Pell Grant eligibility was taken away because they were funding programs on campus on the backs of running subpar programs in the prisons. So there was some, people in prison are always vulnerable to certain kinds of being taken advantage of. And there was not the kind of oversight that perhaps there should have been, and we hope there would be in the future, but it still was the best thing we had. Lastly, and I'll wrap up here, the other most amazing thing that I found in researching this chapter was that not only have we always been here, and not only were there far more programs that existed after the Clinton crime bill than any of us knew about. That in itself wasn't a huge surprise. For the first 7 or 8 years I did this work, we did so with a tacit agreement with the governor of New York that we do that work in secret. So that was not a surprise. But the degree to which what we do in college and prison is emblematic of the larger arguments about education in the United States, about who is privileged to have what kinds of knowledge in America, right? And so the lightning discovery that I made was in certain states we were able to keep college and prison after the demise of Pell. The most emblematic one, and the one we need to learn the most from moving forward, was Ohio. Which had a wonderful commissioner, a wonderful administration that was committed to restoring this. And in crafting a compromise to keep college and prison, they had to agree to two things. The first was that no college and prison program culminate in a degree. And the second was that there would be no study in what we call the liberal arts. That American history, that literature, philosophy, the arts, etc., be banned from being taught to these kinds of people, right? It's an act of unbelievable cynicism and a disregard of the best traditions in American education. So the thing I will end on is just as we're in this moment where I think we can make an effort to restore Pell, the restoration of Pell is the holy grail in this field. We should do so with optimism, not only for our futures, but for the incredible capacity of incarcerated people in New York and nationwide.
Thanks, Max. Andrea, good to see you again. Andrea Cantoro is assistant professor at the University of Baltimore. Going back to 2014, she actually began to offer classes inside of Jessup Prison in Maryland. She was kind enough to invite both of us to the inaugural event for her program because in 2016, when the President Obama and the administration began to move forward with the Second Chance Pell Pilot Initiative, she's one of the universities out of the gate to say this is something that we want to do. And her book chapter talks about that. So, Andrea, talk to us about your work in this area before, and now that you're part of this Pell Pilot Initiative. Tell us what we learned and what we should know.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Good.
So I'll start with a little bit of the history before I started doing this work. So I actually got introduced to prison education by attending an Inside Out Prison Exchange program training. A lot of people know about that program. It started at Temple University in the late 90s, I believe. And they train people to go into prisons across the country and now internationally to bring outside students, college students, inside to take classes with incarcerated students. So bringing the two groups together to learn about lots of different issues. And I started doing that work in 2014. The classes I was teaching were criminal justice, because that's my area. And I started to see that, wow, there are so many people in this institution in Maryland that are taking this course, not getting credit for it, and reading and doing all the work and handing in assignments and engaging in discussion, not getting credit, but they're more active than my students out on in campus. And I tell people that at the university, and they give me a look, but I was seeing this for the first time. And the very first day I entered this prison, when we were talking about the courses that would be offered for no credit, somebody said to me, "Why can't we get credit for these courses?" And I had never thought about it before. And this was 2014, and I was like, I don't know, how come? And I left and I started doing research because I want to solve every problem in the world. Mm-hmm. And I realized that, wow, this is really challenging and this costs a lot of money. So I put it aside, and then 2015 came, and the U.S. Department of Education announced that they would have this experimental sites initiative to allow colleges and universities to provide Pell Grants to incarcerated people. So University of Baltimore applied, and we were one of 66 right now are participating out of 200 applicants. So there was a lot of interest throughout the country to do this work. Obviously, there was a amount of money that the federal government was going to put towards experimental sites. So 66 were selected. Bard is one of the colleges, Goucher, University of Baltimore. I will say that of those who did apply, a lot of them were existing programs like Bard and Goucher. And then there were about 25 new colleges across the country that wanted to do this work. So this was a brand new thing for them. And this was the case at University of Baltimore. There's a mix of community colleges, four-year institutions doing this work. They're offering a lot of certificate programs, associate degrees, bachelor degrees, in many different fields, business administration, sociology, liberal arts, entrepreneurship, carpentry, horticulture, things like that. It's my chapter discusses the variation of these programs. So an important piece of my chapter, I think, is focusing on the big picture of these different schools, but also the importance of workforce preparation and reentry. A lot of my background is working in reentry for many, many years. And I feel like this is a really key piece of the educational programs in prison. I feel like a lot of us do it really well on the inside. Our students are a captive audience, we could say. They have a lot of demands, right? They work, they have their family, they're working on their parole process, going back to court. They have a lot of stressors. But they also get to class and they're all present and they're studying and they're not distracted by phones, technology, and things like that. So we don't really think about the reentry piece. And my chapter focuses on the needs for our students coming out of prison, campus support, helping our students when they get out, either transfer their credits to a different college or help them get adjusted to campus life. Our program has been able to hire a reentry coordinator to do some of this work, but also connecting them to work. And one thing a lot of people don't know, and we're starting to do this on campus, is that Pell Grant students, eligible Pell Grant students, could possibly be also eligible for work study, federal work study. So something we're trying to do is tap into that and hire students on campus or find community groups around campus to hire our students as they're being supported with federal work study. So that's an important reentry piece that I think a lot of people don't think about. How do we connect them to work? That's one key place. So my chapter touches on all of that, the support services, and I go into a lot of the barriers of applying for financial aid. The FAFSA was not designed for incarcerated students, so there's many barriers and roadblocks around that process that might not be that interesting at this point in time, but my chapter touches on that. And then also I talk a little bit about the political context around this, and Max talked about this, needing to restore Pell Grant for all incarcerated people is obviously the next step, and that's where we need to go in order to sustain second Chance Pell. We're in the 4th year of the experiment, I will say, and so far, academic year 2017-18 served 11,000 students with $22 million being spent. My chapter doesn't provide that statistic because I wrote it in 2017 and those numbers weren't out yet. But again, 11,000 students incarcerated have been served under experimental sites, and there's thousands and thousands of other students benefiting because there are other programs that exist throughout the country that may not be an experimental site, but they are benefiting as well. Obviously, we want to increase that number. We want to give access. Like I said, there's 25 new programs that started under experimental sites, and we need to be able to continue that by lifting the ban nationally so we can continue that good work.
Thanks, Andrea. Will, good to see you again.
You too.
We had Max talk about college inside, importance of liberal arts. Andrea talks about the importance of college, but also workforce development. You've seen this for a long time as someone who's actually working to prepare people for work. We know from a recent report from the Society for Human Resource Management and Koch, looked to C-level executives and HR leaders and said, you know what, we're very interested in hiring people who've been incarcerated. Talk to us about your work, because your chapter really does a good deep dive into what is it like to say, yeah, now it's time to work.
Certainly. No, then thanks for having me here, and thanks to Elizabeth and AEI as well. Yeah, my chapter really focuses a lot on the importance of work, and I think the dignity that comes with that, and oftentimes that the criminal justice system just erects so many different barriers that prevent people from actually being able to pursue opportunities in the workforce. And so when I wrote the chapter, at the time I was with an organization called the Center for Employment Opportunities, and it's one of the largest nonprofits in the country that runs transitional work programs for men and women coming home from incarceration. And they're in about 8 different states now. They're going to serve almost 7,000 people this year in all of those programs around the country. And I think what was, a few of the observations that I had, in my time with them as their policy director was how critically important it was for people as they were coming home. And we work with both young and old, is that, for many of the older people that were coming home, they had been removed from the workforce for so long that just understanding and, being able to navigate things that we oftentimes take for granted was a whole new learning process all over again. And it wasn't just the technical skills, it was a lot of those social skills of just coming from an environment inside of a prison, I think as Nancy had said on the previous panel, where the conditions in there are so dire and inhumane, and all of a sudden you're thrust out into society and you have a whole different array of stress factors that you're having to grapple with while you're trying to meet with your parole officer, find housing, figure out how you're going to feed yourself or your family. And so a lot of this was really focused around, I think, first, just providing kind of a stable environment with a support system, because for a lot of people as they come home as well, they just don't have that stable support system around them all of the time. And so that was a big factor at what CEO is all about. And then what we would do is we had a transitional work program where 3 to 4 days a week, these individuals can come to a job site, they're earning income, but more importantly, they're going through the routine of what it is to participate in a job and being able to schedule out your time, factor in how you're going to get there on time, and then start to budget your finances as you're earning income and everything along those lines. And then wrapped around that was really a lot of job development skills where they had a job coach helping them work on a resume, practice interviewing skills and everything, because ultimately what we did was place them into the workforce with employers who, obviously all of them knew that they had some type of a criminal record, but in almost every single instance, the employer consistently came back to CEO asking for more of our participants because they were such great employees. And so, I think, building off of that, what I really touch upon in the chapter is 2 things. Is one, as we've talked a little bit on this panel, and is definitely the case, at both the state and the federal level, is we have to remove a lot of those legal and regulatory barriers that just completely block people that have any type of a criminal record from entering into the workforce. And whether that's ban-the-box laws, occupational licensing, I mean, we can go on and on about that. That is critically important. But the other thing that I really focus a lot of time on is that even when all of those regulatory barriers are removed, people oftentimes, as they're coming home from incarceration, have never been in a community or had the opportunity to even develop skills that are essential to be able to succeed in the workforce. And one of the things that we often talked about at CEO was it was so unfortunate that these individuals were connected into a quality, skills building program only after they had been incarcerated. And it's that they never had that opportunity prior to being incarcerated. And oftentimes, because of that, is what, led them into contact with the criminal justice system in the first place. And so I think the other thing, that we really have to stress about this is that, education, obviously critically important both inside and outside of the justice system, but ensuring that people have access to quality workforce development programming so that when all of those regulatory barriers are finally eliminated and that stigma with the criminal conviction is no longer haunting people, they're also fully equipped to be able to step into those different types of jobs and succeed. Because it's not that any one individual lacks the talent to do it. It's just that they've never been in a situation where that talent can oftentimes be recognized and then cultivated and then allow them to then be in a position to thrive.
Got it. Michelle, welcome to AEI.
Thank you.
Glad to have you here.
Yeah.
Michelle is a second-year doctoral student at NYU. She's also a research fellow at Harvard University. Her section appears in Chapter 10 in the student section, along with one of Andrea's students, same from Max. We mentioned Goucher College, Karen Jones, as well as a chapter. Talk to us about where you were 2 years ago and tell us where you are today. Just talk to us about that and your work you're doing.
2 years ago, 2017, March, I was trying to decide between what schools I was going to go to because I had proceeded the previous December of applying to 9 graduate programs across the country. And you say, well, why would you apply to so many? Well, I didn't think I would get into one. As an incarcerated person who knew that she was going to leave the prison with a certain amount of stigma and taint, I didn't know if I would get in anywhere, so I applied everywhere. I had people actually do research and bring packets of information to schools all across the country. And I applied, and I sat with 5 award letters trying to figure my life out. And that was tough. But I was also extremely blessed, and what I realized is, well, what put me in that position to be able to apply to all these schools and get into 5? Well, I had a high-quality program in the facility in which I was incarcerated in. I had a high-quality standard of faculty, and I had an administration that was supportive of women getting a higher education inside. That meant they provided the computer labs. That meant we had study time. That meant the resources that we needed to make a college experience valuable, worthy, and real, I had access to. So that meant that I could apply and compete with other applicants across the country fairly. And as a result, I had access to an opportunity. And so what does that mean for me in communicating to you? Prison facilities that want to step out and offer college programming to incarcerated men and women across the country, they have to think about going into this work with providing a high-quality program. Without that, then you're offering them the equivalent of card making, and those people cannot step outside of a facility and go right into a college programming. and keep up. It is extremely challenging to manage your reentry, deal with your family, deal with your finances, and then also keep up with school. So the programs have to be quality. The faculty have to be quality. So we just can't offer any kind of card-making patchwork thing and say, oh, we're doing a good program and we're doing a good thing because they're incarcerated people and they don't deserve the same as someone else. The reality is you want people to come out who are able to take care of themselves. So they're off the rolls of what the state has to pay for or taxpayers have to pay for, right? I pay my own way because I have that access to opportunity. So the environment in which prisons are the environment that people are incarcerated in prisons are just as critical then as the programming that you're interested in bringing, as the wonderful things that you're wanting to bring into facilities. A culture of violence, a culture of sexual and gendered violence, a culture of secrecy, a culture of non-transparency, where things happen to people and no one knows and no one has a safe way to tell. When mail is being screened going in and going out, video screen going in and going out, and when the investigators of the facility are also the same boy club, girl club as the guards, and there is no safe place in which to, particularly for women, tell what happens to them. They live, and I have lived, in an environment of such high stress and trauma and violence that it is a wonder that that any of us are doing well, right? So if we're thinking of providing programming, we have to think about the culture of the facility in which these programs are coming into. This is not a Band-Aid type of operation, particularly for women, because most of those women are coming in, 80 to 90% is what the statistics say, already traumatized, or with a trauma disorder. And prisons, because of the unique way in which they are constitutive of violence and they reproduce violence, create unsafe places. I know you think, oh, well, they're tucked away and they're behind the hill and they're behind the fence, they're all right. No, you have to decolonize your mind if you think actually that just providing programming into facilities is enough, right? You have to change the culture. And how do you change the culture? You empower the women themselves. We've gone through I was incarcerated 20 years, so I've gone through different phases of different kind of cultures that superintendents fostered. And when I first came to prison, I was a part of a community of a superintendent that had a progressive eye, who actually heard us when we spoke to her, responded to grievances. And she created a safer, not completely safe, but a safer environment which we could live and learn. She had signs everywhere, and she said, shoot for excellence. Go after excellence. She allowed programming to come in to stimulate our minds. I learned Tai Chi in prison, you people. Come on. And the horse whisperer came, of all things. But I'm saying she recognized that we were people, and she helped foster a culture that was supportive of education, And I think that there is more work to do there. And I love the fact that people are very energized about bringing higher education to the prisons across the country. And we have some dynamic programs. But we cannot forget the quality of life that people are living when they leave their rooms or their cells or their dormitories to go to the education buildings. Because their success is dependent upon both.
Right. Well, first of all, Michelle, thank you for sharing your story, as well as all the students who decided to write for the book, because that's important. I've had a chance to talk to many of them. We've dined and have talked. What I want to do with the time we have is to open it up immediately to questions. Because I know a number of you already have some. You asked it of me and asked me a couple of questions. So what we'll do, as we did before, just state your name and association, and then ask a question. We'll start here, and I'll work my way over.
Thanks. Thank you. I really appreciate all your sharing of what you have written and shared with us. I'm Jing Yan from U.S. Department of Education and Policy Office. One question I would like to ask the last lady is that when you were saying about quality of the program and the quality of faculty, would you share with us specifically what you have experienced, what you have thought that really quality? Because actually I'm writing a paper on this moment.
Excellent.
So you'll get a credit in that paper for that.
Absolutely. Okay, so I have been a part of two amazing models.
I've been a part of the Ball State model. Ball State University came in with full administrative group of people to administer the program, and their faculty were the same faculty they taught on campus, and those faculty brought the same syllabus. There was a computer lab, so they required the same work, the same presentations from us, and that's important. It should be comparable. Now, granted, I've also been a part of some classes where it was the multiple choice thing, and I don't know how you take intro to criminology with a multiple choice test, but somehow it happened to me. But you have that kind of model. Now, the main model that has started after Pell left and after Indiana got rid of their funding was created with volunteer faculty who were retired and working full-time at another school. And they too had that kind of determined quality to bring the same syllabus, the same teaching, the same program that's being offered, that was being offered on campus. I think that's absolutely critical. I need to have learned a certain body of knowledge by the time I go to the next level.
I think it's a terrific question. It's one that permeates the work at every level. The one thing that I would say, in addition to all of Michelle's terrific comments, is that we can't look exclusively to the jail or the prison or the jailers to manage quality, right? College and prison actually reflects what leaders and practitioners in higher education think about what they do, right? So when we look out at the entire American landscape, does anyone think that we in higher education are doing the best we can to find and engage the best and most talent? And of course, nobody does, right? And it's tragic, but it's true. Actually, when you look at the United States that way, asking the question, where do we find the most disengaged talent? Our correctional systems are, tragically, the place to go, right? The biggest story in the news this week is this corruption scandal in college admission, right? It's fancy, rich, famous people paying in the most corrupt way to get their children into, name brand institutions. But I would add that their fundamental insight is correct. It's one we share. The way we do college access and admission in the United States is broken. It's corrupt. We have to do better, and this is a great way to start.
Andrea, your faculty members from your university teach in the program. Okay.
Yeah, they do. And I also want to add with the high quality piece is that when our students apply to the Second Chance College program that we run, they're applying to the University of Baltimore. So they have to meet the same admission requirements that students on campus.
Right.
We're trying to do everything the same. Obviously, the technology is an issue that we won't talk about right here because it would take forever. But we try to replicate and bring in the same instructors, but also that admissions process. So when our students leave that prison, they come straight to campus and just enroll in courses because they're already a student. So.
Good point. See a question here.
Hi, good morning. Stefan Labulio from Justice Innovations. I've worked in corrections for 27 years. For decades, the GED-type programs have been the mainstay of correctional education programs. In 2014, there was a major disruption. The test became harder to pass, it became more expensive, and it was only offered online. That presented difficulties for most of the 5,000 correctional facilities in our country that don't have the GED. Correctional education directors have reported plummeting numbers of students taking the test and passing the test. And I just wondered, as we advocate for post-secondary programs, are we missing the needed support for the many individuals, and most of the individuals in our correctional facilities, who aspire to college but need first to get their high school equivalency and get their skills up?
Thank you.
We find the short answer is yes. We can always do more and we can always do better, and we should do, and there's a vast room for improvement. But in our experience, we find something counterintuitive, which is when you build a ambitious, high-end program, what that does is inspire people who have yet to do things like complete the GED to see that pursuit in a completely different way, right? Everyone in prison has a real cynicism and a real reason to be cynical about their relationship with institutions, right? So for us, we see actually the establishment of first-rate, Michelle was calling them quality programs, college programs, as the best way to energize that learning that we think of as happening earlier. That can be counterintuitive. We think it's the most effective way to go.
And what I would add to that is, in our state, what we did is that those students who were able to tutor offered pre-college to anybody who needed help in GED. For example, in our particular facility that I was in, the GED, I'm going to be PC here, the programming was
Free
not...
enterprise. Go ahead.
The programming was not up to par. You actually had a teacher sitting in the classroom and not engaging the students and letting tutors do all the teaching. So we realized that there was a population of people who were sitting in GED classes that could not move out without help. And so what we developed was the pre-college program. And the pre-college program ran and is actually currently running now, and it runs with, again, volunteer faculty, retired faculty. We had postdocs in there. We had graduate students who were coming in there to basically help people with basic math, algebra, reading, and they were doing it during the same time and the same staffing, because staffing is such a huge issue, that the college students had study hall. So now, it's not an issue of staff, it's not an issue of space, it's not an issue of time. We're using the same time and space in order to get that other population up. And that's one of the things that we offered, because we saw the same thing. There were a group of GED students who were just never coming out.
And when we say education for liberation, that includes adult basic education, adult secondary education. Focus here has been on post-secondary degree attainment, smaller community. But for us, it's all the way around. And thank you for your work in Maryland. In fact, Maryland in the last couple of years identified that if you actually arrive without a high school diploma, automatically you must go into a GED program. Got a question here.
Thanks. Dan Burns, Catholic University of America. When you talk about quality in these educational programs, what I hear is personnel. High-quality programs come from high-quality teachers. What are some ways any of you might suggest that we could incentivize, whether it's secondary or especially higher ed, teachers or potential teachers, unemployed PhDs, faculty members who have busy schedules in other ways? What are some ways we could incentivize either those individuals or their institutions to send them off and teach these classes for this population that needs it so much?
Sure. And lady in the back had her hand up. She'll ask actually the last question, and then you can respond to both or whichever you'd like. Yes, ma'am.
Pat Marks, Putting Mercy into Criminal Justice in Maryland. Follow-up question to Stefan, which is, we have to start at the very beginning. And my heart is in early childhood education, but I will go with the ABE and GED question. More importantly, I'll go with the special ed question, which is, what accommodations are you making for students with special education needs?
Okay, great.
So I want to respond to the question about incentivizing and how do we get people interested in going in to teach. I'm just going to talk from my personal experience, but I imagine you've seen similar things, that is not a problem. People reach out to me all the time saying, can I teach a course in your prison program? I don't have to recruit. People really come to me, and I sometimes have to because I need biology, right? So no biology instructor has come to me. I've had to seek that out. But usually people come because they're really interested and they want to try something different. And most of the instructors who approach me are people who have never taught in prison before, but they are reading the articles that I write or hearing about the things that I'm saying. And I talk about our students all the time. Or they come in and they meet our students and they're like, I want to come back. I want to teach this group. They're really engaged. They're more engaged than my students on campus, which I always say. But I imagine it might be similar for you, Max.
Yeah, I think, first of all, anyone who teaches recognizes that these are a group of students who recognize what's at stake for them and their families in these classrooms like no other students faculty teach. So faculty are typically energized. I think it's really important to focus on the institutions, not the individual faculty. Faculty are the most college faculty in America are the most overqualified and undercompensated population we have in the United States, right? I disagree with Michelle. I do not think we can rely on volunteer faculty. I think that the system of higher education in the United States is in total crisis. How we pay for it and how we produce generations of faculty in the future is unknown right now. So we work in that atmosphere. But we also, I think that crisis provides us some kind of opportunity in that we know we have to refashion how we deliver knowledge about mathematics, the natural sciences, history, civics, philosophy to general population. And I think college and prison not only is a way to completely redefine the purpose of our prison systems, but also to help us rethink how we do higher education in the future.
And I just would add, there's a couple places, obviously, where students, faculty can get postdocs through and other students who are taking like inside-out courses, where they actually get to interact with. People ask me all the time, well, how do I get involved in the prison? I suggest that they go in and just volunteer and ask questions. Ask questions of the women and the men inside and find out what they're interested in. And a lot of times you'll find that their appetite for a higher education program or whatever you want to bring, you'll learn that in communication. And also what I want to say about the retired faculty, right, is that is a valuable population of people who are at home, that are fully paid, and are not worried about how they're going to pay the rent. And they could be in these facilities continuing on to educate the next generation of people. I consider retired faculty a major asset, particularly in nurturing younger faculty as they come up. So, but that's my particular point of view. And a lot of people, may not agree with that, but I think that along with finding ways to get people in prison so they can learn and see the people and meet them and build relationships, it has to be a little bit organic and informal. It has to be, because we're talking about people's lives and preparing people for the next level.
Will? Yeah, I think to Max's point, this comes down to what we're going to prioritize. And we my organization, Just Leadership USA, right now, we have a huge campaign underway to overhaul the state of Wisconsin's probation system, which is just woefully out of control. But that correction system there spends more than they do on the entire university system of Wisconsin for post-secondary education. And that is a trend that you see increasingly in more states across the country. And so if you think about a lot of common sense reform that can significantly curb the costs that states, throw into their correction system, and then in turn taking that cost savings and being able to funnel it into higher education where you are able to pay teachers, whether they're working in traditional college settings or inside, correctional facilities, the return on investment, not even talking about just the social justice concerns right there, is going to be significant. And especially, I think, in a time right now where employers are just beyond desperate to find skilled employees that they can fill positions with. A lot of the programs that we're currently providing, are going to, in terms of education, are going to be completely antiquated within 5 to 10 years as the economy continues to evolve. And so, it's coming down to, I think, really at the end of the day, where do we want to put our resources? And, a lot of the work that I do around the country, just talking to the average, citizen, they have very little understanding of how much of their tax dollars going into the corrections system as opposed to the education system oftentimes. And when you tell them that, it starts to twist the thinking around. And so I think part of this is just, yes, the volunteer is great, but if we really want to take a lot of what all of these chapters in this book are focused on, and I think scale it, which is really at the end of the day what this is, all about, it's going to take a much smarter investment of resources to make that happen.
And you mentioned special ed. Linda Gibbs is a former deputy mayor in New York City, worked under Bloomberg. Under her portfolio was a social impact bond program of the Young Men's Initiative. In that chapter, and it's written really for state and local leaders who are saying, I'm thinking about social impact bonds, what if? GED starting early is something that she recognized was vitally important and had to go back to Dave to try to figure out how to go earlier. Since we're also at AEI, Catherine, who's one of my colleagues here, is an expert on early child education, so I would say take a look, Catherine Stevens, at her work. Well, as you know, all good things must come to an end. We have now reached the end of our event. First of all, let me thank the 4 people who are on stage with me right now, as well as the 4 authors who are before us. I want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and to hear authors talk about education for liberation. It's more than a sound bite. It's not an intro for a rap song, although it could be. The important part is we think about education and its root word, going back to Latin educo, it means bringing people from darkness into light. And what we're trying to do is to help 2.3 million people in numerous ways come out and re-enter better than they were involved. We all take different perspectives. For me, it's not an issue of the right wing versus the left wing, as much as giving people who are coming out of prison wings to fly away and land into situations that work well. So with that, I want to thank all of you and thank all of our panelists. Earlier, we have copies of the book outside for sale. We have a table right here for some of the authors who are going to stay along and give you an autograph. It will be worth something someday. Thanks a lot.